And that was when the lectures were supposed to be last year. And then, of course, with the intervening changes that had to be made and rescheduling the lectures to May, it created a difficulty for David, and so he was not able to come and join us. His lecture is in the book, and I certainly would recommend that you continue to read that, but David himself was not able to come and speak with us. And so this happens once in a while, and we were very fortunate to be able to have Jason Dickey come and speak for you today on this same topic. Jason is the son of Thaxter and Wanda Dickey. Many of you know Thaxter and Wanda, longtime employees of the college here. Thaxter is well known in not only the college here, but also for his gospel meeting work throughout the country. Jason graduated from Florida College with a BA in Liberal Studies in 2010 and married Megan. And they have 3 young children who are the cutest children in the brotherhood. Did I mention that Megan is my daughter? It's probably the most controversial thing that's going to be said today. But we're delighted that Jason is able to be here today. He preaches at the Lutz congregation currently, as well as doing clinical research as a programmer for the past 9 years. He graduated from Western Kentucky University with a master's degree in economics and is putting that degree to work in his clinical research programming work, but also preaches the gospel as well. They came to the Tampa area in the summer of 2017 and have been preaching with the Lutz congregation for the last year and a half. We are delighted that Jason has consented with kind of a short time notice to prepare the lecture for today and to present it to you. And so we heartily commend to you Brother Jason Dickey.
Well, good morning. I appreciate you all's attendance here today. I'm not Brother Padfield, and so hopefully you all aren't too disappointed. Even still, what we will do today is try our best to handle the topic this morning. Gratefully, his work, as has been stated, is in the lecture book, and so we can still learn from his good research and insight onto the topic there. I appreciate the good introduction by David, and of course the opportunity provided by the Bible department to fill in today. But I especially want to make note of the appreciation I have for my wife's sacrifices that were necessary to afford me the time to be here today. Jesus is the master teacher. This moniker is based on ample evidence on his ability to address issues authoritatively and insightfully, his ability to answer the unanswerable, but maybe most distinctively, his ability to teach powerful, layered truths with the telling of a simple story. Many preachers, myself included, have begun a series of lessons on the parables full of enthusiasm and vigor, only to become more puzzled by the studying. The parables of Jesus are at once too simple to fill up single Bible classes, while simultaneously being so complex that the student leaves wondering whether they've understood Jesus' point at all. Of course, there's some hyperbole here, but the reality is that Jesus' parables are much more than just simple illustrations. When looking across the landscape of the parables through the Gospels, we do see some repeated, but this repetition is amplified by the individual contexts to bring to light different points of emphasis as demanded by the different circumstances in which they're told. Now, many scholars will look at this repetition of the parables through the Gospels and try to establish some sort of single source that has been adapted by the author. Now, this idea of a single source is that there is a single incident that occurred that has then been changed by the gospel writers themselves. Now, many will blanch at that approach to Scripture because it challenges a conservative view and understanding of inspiration, but in some ways, what is even more significant to me is that more than just challenging how inspiration may or may not work, they're actually undermining the ability of Jesus to teach. It gives credit to the authors of the Gospels rather than Jesus' ability to teach and adapt to each circumstance. Jesus could use similar language and stories in multiple circumstances to strike people in new and different ways. The Gospel writers simply allow us to see these differences while emphasizing specific points within their writings. But the real credit should go to Jesus. Now, this is all an important background when discussing the parables as a whole, but especially when discussing the two parables that many have argued over there being a single source: Luke 14, 12 through 24, and Matthew 22, 1 through 14. They are respectively the parable of the great banquet and the parable of the wedding feast for the king's son. These two stories share some superficial similarities, but ultimately, given the differences in context, the variance in language, and even some of the details included, they actually offer two very distinct stories for two very distinct purposes. And only in the hands of a master teacher can such similar stories be wielded so powerfully and so differently and with such care. This morning, we'll take each of these two parables in turn. We'll discuss any historical and biblical context necessary of Luke 14, and then finish with an analysis of Luke 14, and then repeat this process for Matthew chapter 22. Let's begin, though, with some of the background context necessary to really understand the banquet image that Jesus is using. And although one is simply a banquet and the other a wedding banquet, this content in some ways does apply to both parables. Firstly, as this is Jesus, and he never said anything that we have recorded without it having insightful meaning into our understanding of God in the Old Testament, it is important to place the image of the banquet within the Bible framework as a whole. Dennis Smith, in his work on the symposium meal in the ancient world, argues for similarity in the way the Jews utilized banquets as a culture with the way the rest of the ancient world did, even the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and so on and so forth. Now, this idea is not as relevant to the Old Testament use of the image as much as it relates more specifically to the use of banquets in the Gospels, but either way, what it does offer us at this time as a basis to start with. Namely, meals are important in every culture and in every society from all time. Focusing just on the biblical text, we see the significance of eating meals and providing meals for others. Whether it is Abraham feeding angels, or the Passover feast, or Esau selling his birthright for a meal, we see eating as a primary mover for the biblical story. And I'm sure you all are at this very moment running through a list of all the meals that exist in the Bible and wondering why I included the ones I did and why I left out so many others that would have been great examples. But we need to consider, though, that it isn't just a biblical idea, it's a primary part of human life. Every culture, every society uses meals, whether a fancy meal to celebrate a business deal or a pizza party after a Little League game. We share food with others in a wide range of circumstances and occasions, and each has its own rules of decorum and social expectations. The Bible, of course, highlights many meals, but in several cases, these meals are brought to the forefront as an image of something that will happen. It provides a framework for a moment that will come. Some meals in the biblical text even become prophetic. Just like how marriage is used as an image of God's relationship to his people, meals are used to foreshadow the communion that will eschatologically occur for the faithful. The glimpses we see of this image, starting all the way back at the beginning of the biblical text, are highlighted and expounded upon by the prophets and begin to be fulfilled even at the hands of the Messiah himself. One such example of these early meals that provides this sort of prophetic image is in Exodus 24, where 74 men representing the nation of Israel ascended the mountain to see God and then eat and drink. This is the first point made at the Brother Padfield's lecture recorded in the book, and it's a fitting place to start, because this may be an image or story tucked away in Exodus, but that doesn't mean it is to be passed over. It is one to be brought out and seen in the light of these great biblical concepts of an eschatological meal with God, as Brother Padfield has done for us. If we want to look more specifically at prophecy, though, Isaiah 25, 6 through 9 is just the passage to turn to. It indicates the coming together of the world to all dine with God in bounty and blessing, and this banquet is a celebratory feast for victory over the great enemy, death. Isaiah 25, 6 through 9 reads, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, a rich food full of marrow of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken." It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Kenneth Bailey notes the significance of Isaiah 25, even amongst other banquet prophecies. And there's several concepts in this particular passage that stand out and are immediately relevant to our discussion of these banquet parables. The first and most obvious idea to note is the 5 uses of the word all in this passage. This banquet that is seen to be fulfilled by the Messiah is something that is extended to us all. Bailey notes that during the intertestamental period, this passage was understood to be something that would be fulfilled, but the application to the Gentiles was lost. But there's another element we see here. Further, we see a significant element of victory in Isaiah 25. This isn't just any victory, but the victory over death itself. Many other passages about the nations coming to God will mention the bringing of gifts to God, like Isaiah 18 or 60. But notice that in Isaiah 25, there is no bringing of gifts to God. It is God providing a victory meal for us over his salvation. This is pure grace. God is giving a victory feast to all mankind over his victory over death. Now, many have taken this scene, specifically Derek, to try and say that our parables today are also part of this idea of a victory feast, a banquet feast thrown by a conquering king. And to help make the point, he uses Isaiah 1 as a tie to bring Luke 14 and Matthew 22 into concert with the idea of a victorious banquet. And Derek talks about the midrash and the theology of holy war written in it as a background. All this is, in my opinion, a little bit difficult to support when applied to our parables in question, but what it does do is offer at the very least some magnanimity to the humble stories Jesus tells and places them within this greater context of feasting within the prophets. And it also helps to highlight this greater theme that existed in the ancient world of celebrating victories over enemies with a victory banquet. And so, although I don't think Luke 14 or Matthew 22 are victory banquets in the same sense, I do think the idea of a victory banquet does provide some useful insight into the image as a whole. I think that we can understand the significance of the banquet, though, without trying nearly this hard. To the wayward pilgrim searching for the pearly gates, the image of a banquet feast with God as the host and all the nations as a guest is more than just a pleasant picture. This is hope itself. To be able to dine in victory over freedom from sin and death with the Creator himself is at the heart of any longing the Christian may have. Isaiah 25 offers this picture, but it isn't fully realized until we hear it from the lips of the Messiah himself. Jesus, who is the Son of the living God, offers to mankind this very same real hope of banqueting with the King in his palace. And every Christian who participates in the taking of the Eucharist experiences this same longing and clings to this very same image. This is not to say that the aforementioned parables are talking about the Lord's Supper in any way, but the image is correlated, and it does offer similar hope, even if under a different cloud of emphasis. But going back to Dennis Smith, who also outlines some of the key features involved in a first-century symposium banquet. These banquets, as Smith outlines, tended to be small affairs, less than 11 guests, so as to allow those gathered to interact more intimately. The evening would begin with the washing of feet, and then reclining on their couch. These couches would outline the wall of a small room. The persons attending would be ordered from greatest importance to least importance along the wall on their places where they reclined. And after everybody is seated, servants would bring in tables with food on it that they would eat off of. These tables would be removed at the finishing and completion of the meal, at which time the guests would drink a libation to the gods, and that would mark the beginning of the discussion point for the evening, in which they would exchange ideas and discuss any relevant topic. The whole idea implied by this method of dining and discussing is exclusivity. It's a strong emphasis on rank and social order. Limited numbers to allow for more intimate conversation, but also made such gatherings even more exclusive. The ordering of positions around the room highlights the social construct of rank and forces everyone to recognize this hierarchy. And although there is no direct connection between this description of a symposium banquet and Jesus' banquet parables per se, other than maybe the specific Greek words that are used, it does at least offer one point of consideration. In a world of exclusivity, in a world of power, in a world that is based upon social standing, the idea of filling a banquet hall with a great number of guests of any ilk certainly contramands the form of the day. And whether or not it is fair to apply such a direct point to Jesus' parable or not, it certainly is clear that within both these parables there is a strong emphasis on the universal invitation that we saw in Isaiah 25. And the idea of an universal, all-inclusive invitation would be unique in any culture, be unique in any society. But Jesus simply proposes the idea with the image of a simple dinner party. Focusing more specifically on Luke 14, though, there are some specifics that are worth expounding upon. Beginning verses 1 through 24 actually are a single unit in Luke's narrative, revolving around a dinner party where Jesus is invited to dine with the Pharisees. And beginning in verses 1 through 6, we have an account of a man who is healed from dropsy. There are two elements worth noting from this 6-verse prelude to our parable today. The first is the aristocratic setting of a symposium-type meal. Willie Braun indicates that the form of banquet described in Luke 14 will be consistent with the sort of symposium meal described from the work of Dennis Smith. So we combine those two ideas together, if you accept it as valid, we immediately place this sequence of events in the context of an aristocratic dinner meant to challenge Jesus' ideologies and teachings in their own exclusive way. Now, this helps to show that Jesus' point about their willingness to pull an ox out of a ditch on the Sabbath, but unwillingness to let a poor man be healed, is indicative of a larger issue of the Pharisees' greed and self-important attitude. And so, what we see are some self-important Pharisees inviting Jesus to one of their aristocratic dinners only to immediately be challenged on their basic morality from the very beginning of the meal. The second element, though, in these first 6 verses is a little bit more of an aside. Once again, turning to Willie Braun, who in his work on the social rhetoric of Luke 14 points out a connection between dropsy, a disease where someone has an insatiable thirst despite massive amounts of water retention, points out a connection between dropsy and greed. He notes a plethora of examples from ancient literature where philosophers directly connect avarice with dropsy. For instance, Diogenes compared money lovers to dropsies. As dropsies, though filled with fluid, crave drink, so money lovers, though loaded with money, crave more of it, yet both to their demise, for their desires increase the more they acquire the object of their cravings. Although this in no way, I think, impacts the general meaning of this section, I do think it helps to further highlight the irony of the rich and greedy Pharisees with Jesus' purpose of establishing a kingdom that is truly for all. They are the ones with dropsy, much more than the one who actually had the disease. The next section, verses 7 through 14, again, further establishes the setting for our parable. Jesus offers two pieces of advice, one for what to do when invited to a banquet and the other for what to do when hosting a banquet. Both pieces of advice revolve around humility and generosity, and both of these points, again, help demonstrate the vices of the Pharisees and the way that they practiced and operated in these settings. They had a desire to claim the highest chair and the desire to expand one's own influence and social standing by the dinner guests you would invite. The idea, then, is that by sitting in the higher seats or in having more esteemed guests at your banquet, you then are elevated as well. Jesus' ministry was about the exact opposite of this. It was never about self-aggrandizement or furthering one's own affluence, but rather completely focused on the needy and the helpless. Luke's gospel makes this of primary focus from the very beginning of his narrative by highlighting Jesus' reading of Isaiah 61 and Luke 4. This is a prophecy about proclaiming liberty to the captives and good news to the poor. And Jesus boldly reads this and proclaims himself the fulfillment of this prophecy. And this in turn sets the stage for the entirety of his ministry and his purpose, but especially is emphasized in Luke, but also characterized in all 4 Gospels. And so then we get to the parable in Luke 14. Let's read together starting in verse 15. When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." But he said to him, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused.' Another said, 'I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I've married a wife, and therefore I cannot come.' And so the servant came and reported these things to his master. And then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame.' And the servant said, 'Sir, what you have commanded has been done, and still there is room.' And the master said to the servant, 'Go out to the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who are invited shall taste my banquet.'" Again, I think there's a couple contextual notes worth pointing out here. First is that there's a double invitation that is sent. Ancient custom, as described by Arthur Just, was to send an invitation for a banquet at a future date. After the acceptance was received, a second invitation would be issued at the time of the banquet feasts, so that the guests would only arrive once the food was actually prepared. The purpose of highlighting this is to show that by not coming, these guests were not only insulting the host, but actually violating a commitment that they would have already made. The excuses offered by the guests has also been a point of much discussion. Although few scholars that I read will call the excuses themselves frivolous, most seem to bypass any detailed discussion, pointing out that the excuses themselves are not of much interpretive value. Once again, though, we return to the work of Derrit, who, in arguing for his picture of a holy war feast being portrayed in Matthew 22 and Luke 14, makes the connection between the list of excuses and the rules for exemption from warfare in Deuteronomy 20. Now, Derrit is not alone in making this connection, as many scholars note the similarity between these two lists. Equally worth noting, though, is that many also point out that the inexact language makes this connection difficult to establish. I would offer, though, that if one is of the mind to connect Deuteronomy 20 to Luke 14, the point could be made that Jesus is stating that even things that exempted one from serving in Israel's army are not satisfactory to keep from attending the banquet feast of the Master. Some others, like Mark Black, have tried to allegorize the excuses, claiming that the first two represent mammon getting in the way of the kingdom, and the third excuse of getting married would represent family preventing one from joining the kingdom. And although these ideas are biblical, I see no reason to try and allegorize the excuses themselves. In fact, I find the best way to view this parable and the excuses is outlined by Howard Marshall, who asserts that the emphasis is not on those that refuse, but the emphasis of the parable is much more on those who accept the invitation. Arthur Just furthers this assertion by highlighting verse 15 as the key to interpretation. 15, which says, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." The parable is about those that are able to be brought in, about those that accept the invitation. The invitations are sent to all, especially to those that are lost along the highways and the byways. And ultimately, Jesus is showing that the Pharisees and those that engage in such aristocratic practices are not a part of the kingdom. Only the meek and the humble are. Jesus is challenging the practices of the Pharisees directly, and he's trying to establish a new way to view the world, a view based on uplifting the disenfranchised, not castigating those less fortunate than oneself. This is a message that we sometimes lose sight of, simply because of the frequency of it in the New Testament. This frequency, although sometimes dulling our attention, should actually really serve to highlight it as being of the utmost importance. Even today, in our own country, in our own neighborhoods, we hear the cries and pleas of the maligned and the persecuted to be granted something better. What our friends and neighbors often don't realize, though, is that something better has already been established, and that all are invited to participate. That there's a place and that there's a promise for there to be no more maligning and ostracization. True unity does exist within the kingdom, And we who were once part of the scattered poor along the highways now in turn change into the servants delivering the invitations, trying to fill the great banquet hall of the Lord. And so then we see a symposium banquet thrown by a few aristocratic Pharisees to challenge the ideas and engage Jesus on their own turf, becoming the perfect foil for Jesus to establish the true nature of the kingdom. A kingdom where all are invited to come in and dine with the king, where all can come in and celebrate the victory over sin and death in the world. In Luke 14, we see Jesus telling a simple story that emphasizes the universal invitation that exists to dine with the king, and yet within it, we find many deep layered truths about not only the kingdom, but also about the world in which he humbled himself to come and free. And he freed it not just from some external power, but even from its own avarice and self-centeredness. And so Jesus says, there is still room in the kingdom, directly contramanding the exclusivity of not only the aristocracy, but even many of the day's bourgeois. We need to get lost in cultural context and philosophical points about diseases to understand the point. Jesus offers a lot more than just one idea. He emphasizes one profound idea. And we may find the idea of the world being called to dine with the master as simple, but that doesn't mean it isn't powerful. Don't lose sight of the room that is available for all to join in. When we turn our attention to Matthew 22, though, we notice almost immediately a key difference between these two parables. While Luke 14 is a parable about a banquet, Matthew 22 is about a wedding feast for the king's son. And so to start with, let's consider what a wedding feast would have looked like in this time period. As outlined by Crane, we see that invitations to weddings were an honor. To refuse to come would be an insult. And now this would only be magnified, as in this parable, it's a royal affair. Crane goes on to articulate that marriage customs involved engagement arranged by parents, followed by a betrothal period. The betrothal was essentially considered a marriage without sexual relations and could be ended only by divorce. The death of one betrothed made the other a widow or widower. And once the betrothal period started, there would then be double invitations sent for the wedding. One at the initial betrothal and then a second just before the actual wedding banquet. 2 invitations would be required as the betrothal period could last upwards of a year. At the time of the wedding, a crier would go through the streets to alert the invited guests it was time for the wedding. Everyone would then fall in with the groom and the bride as part of the wedding party as they walked through the streets in a processional that typically would end at the house of the married couple would reside in. After the arrival of all the guests, the doors would then be locked, and even invited guests who showed up late would not be allowed in, and also excluded would be those who were not attired appropriately. Now, turning our attention more specifically to the Bible's use of marriage, we see several other elements that are useful. As Christians that are familiar with the Scriptures, we immediately see the connection to the language not only of Paul, but even to the prophets. From Hosea to Ezekiel, we see the image of Israel being a bride to God. But one thing we take for granted is that the Messiah would fulfill this role as the bridegroom. Jeffrey Gibbs points out that it wouldn't have been until John the Baptist that the connection between the Messiah and the bridegroom would have ever been made. See John 3:29. In fact, Lutz clarifies this further with a quotation, Jewish tradition knows of a future eschatological banquet in the New Age, but it is not a marriage feast. The idea of Israel as God's bride seldom has an eschatological accent in Jewish tradition, and it is scarcely ever connected with the Messiah. The significance of this is important to consider. Although we commonly see the Messiah as a bridegroom, there's something fresh about it in the Gospels that we need to try and maintain. The Jews understood the break that existed between them and God as they went into captivity. And any who read the first 3 chapters of Genesis understand the gap between God and man because of sin. But it isn't all the way until God comes in the form of man that we truly begin to see the power of God's plan. God isn't just going to restore a relationship like the one that existed throughout the Old Testament law of Moses. God is restoring to us a relationship that is much closer to a marriage. Consider that. Of all the relationships that exist, ruler to his people, slave to a master, an employer to a worker, a parent to a child, God chooses to use the one relationship that is the most personal, that is the most intimate, to be the one embodied by the Messiah. Don't lose sight of the significance here. It is novel. It is shocking. And so we can't allow our familiarity with the image to keep us from seeing it as freshly as we should. This connection that we often take for granted has immense impact on our view of not only marriage itself, but also our relationship with Christ and God. What is important about this point in Matthew 22 is that it establishes a more clear application to the parable. Whereas Luke 14 was about there still being room in the kingdom, Matthew 22 turns its attention much more directly to the kingdom itself, even from the outset in its use of the wedding motif. Consider the implications of Revelation 19, starting in verse 6, that reads, "Then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters and like the sound of many peals of thunder, crying out, 'Hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure. For the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints.' And the angel said to me, 'Write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb.' And he said to me, 'These are the true words of God.'" Of this passage, right pins, here John's vision focuses on the fact that the great moment has come at last. This is what the world had been waiting for ever since Genesis 1, ever since the covenant with Abraham, ever since the covenant with Moses, ever since the renewal of the covenant promised at the time of the exile. Marriage is the ultimate covenant, and Jesus is the ultimate bridegroom. There's a sense of fulfillment, of excitement, of rightness and fitness that emerges at last after the sorry tale of human rebellion, wickedness, pride, and arrogance has run its course. And so this wedding metaphor in Matthew 22, and reflected even in Revelation 19, reflects an image of union between God and man that had so long been sought for. And before we get any further, we need to make sure that even from just this base setting of the parable, we understand that God is relating an immense theological implication about mankind being brought back to God. This parable isn't just about ancient customs of weddings. It's about you and me and all mankind being allowed to participate in a reunification with God. This parable wasn't just for the Pharisees or the crowd surrounding Jesus. It is a parable for any that wish to be restored into a relationship with God. But note that this connection about the parable being related to those who would be kingdom citizens isn't made just with the use of the wedding metaphor, but it's also in the immediate context of the parable. Immediately preceding this parable in Matthew chapter 21 is the parable of the wicked tenants. This parable of the tenants is shown to be about the crucifixion of Jesus and really sets the stage for Matthew 22. R.T. France, in his commentary on Matthew, offers the idea of a historical progression from Matthew 21 to 22. And although he dismisses the idea as too esoteric for the original audience to understand, I think it actually has a lot to commend itself as a point to consider. After all, how many times did the crowds or even apostles walk away themselves from Jesus, confused? By historical progression, what I mean is that the events foreshadowed in the parable of the wicked tenants are followed historically by the events foreshadowed in the parable of the wedding feast for the king's son. The idea is that Jesus in this section isn't just offering a few parables to teach a few different principles, but is using parables to teach and to prophesy, and is doing so throughout a united discourse. The parable of the wicked tenants is about the crucifixion. The parable of the wedding feast for the king's son is about the church. Just like how one parable follows the other chronologically, the events prophesied in these parables follow one another chronologically. Now, this certainly isn't a widely accepted reading of these two passages, but it is one that I think not only fits the messages of the parables individually, but also helps to unlock what I would argue is one of the key points of Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Namely, that the parable is directed to us. So then, to apply this reading, we would be saying that these two parables are teaching a sequence, that after Jesus' death, there will be a resurrection and a moment for mankind to be brought back into union with God at this grand wedding feast. There will be many who have already accepted the invitation to be the people of God, who will then reject the opportunity to participate in the marriage feast. This group would then be a representation of the Jews who reject the gospel. And when they forego their place, they will be judged and destroyed. After and concurrent with this destruction is an invitation for all who inhabit this world to be given a chance to come and join in and participate. I think there's much to commend a historical progression from the preceding parable to the one that we have here. And in fact, I think it's a key part to unlocking many of the powerful ideas here in Matthew 22. And so then let's read together Matthew 22, 1 through 14. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention, and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And then he said to his servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, but those invited are not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find.' And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. And so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" We discussed the double invitation element in Luke 14, and we see it as one of the similarities here in Matthew 22. What we see added in Matthew 22, though, is not just a double invitation, but actually what is a triple invitation. The whole sequence at the beginning of the parable goes from far-fetched to actually outlandish. The reality is that no subjects would reject an invitation from the king to attend a wedding feast for his son. It would be a great honor to receive that first invitation and to be included in this momentous event. So then imagining someone who accepted this invitation and then refused to come at the time of the feast is unreasonable. If that sort of insulting response by a guest is unreasonable, the response of the king to send another messenger to bring in the guests is even more so. A king offering yet another chance to those who refuse to come would have been unparalleled. The response to the third invitation simply escalates this picture even more and is completely shocking. Some give excuses and some walk away, but some even kill the messenger. Jeffrey Gibbs wrote about this sequence in this way: "The refusal to come is inexplicable. The repeated invitation is fanciful. And the brutal murdering of the messenger is absurdly exaggerated, and even the king's response is strange." This hyperbolic depiction to many is a justification of reading the parable much more allegorically than we would Luke 14. In Luke 14, the emphasis was on the blessing received by those who could dine in the kingdom. And because of the added details and exaggerated depiction of a similar tale here in Matthew 22, many scholars have sought to try and tease out added lessons and points of emphasis by reading it allegorically. I would argue that the depiction in Matthew 22 is building off of the judgment language of Matthew 21, and so is showing recourse for the rejection of the Messiah. The quick escalation of the king to go from multiple invitations to burning down their city, presumably his own city, is pretty shocking. But Jesus would have undoubtedly done this intentionally to show that though the king may be patient, there will be judgment. Most authors, including Ben Witherington, argue that we should see the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 here in this image. that the rejection of the invitation, the killing of the messenger, and the general lack of response to the king should represent the Jews, and therefore the going out and bringing in from the roads and the highways represents the outside the city, should represent the gospel going out to the Gentiles. I think this is a reasonable way of reading the parable, but I would also still caution against reading this story too allegorically. Jesus certainly, at this point in his ministry, is speaking much more openly about coming events. His last week of teaching is characterized most distinctly by his direct challenge of the Pharisees. And although the language in 21 and 22 has not yet gotten so direct as it will in another couple chapters, we can already begin to see those elements coming into these parables. The reason why I would caution against reading this parable too allegorically is because the key application of the parable is not in the rejection and the burning of the city, nor is it even really in the universal invitation to attend the wedding feast. Rather, I would argue the key here is the cryptic ending where the king walks through the feast, identifies a man not appropriately attired, who he then throws out into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. This last depiction is key because it's the piece that's new. It's the piece that's showing something a little bit different. We have seen parables about the kingdom of heaven being for everyone. We will see sections like in Matthew 24 that more specifically deal with the judgment of the Jews and Jerusalem. But here we get a little bit more clarity on the character of those who are part of the kingdom. This is where we get into a deep discussion on what these wedding garments represent. Grab two commentaries, any two commentaries on Matthew, and compare what they say about the wedding garment. And I will guarantee with almost absolute certainty that they will give different interpretations. And so that being the case, I feel justified to make up my own interpretation. Before we get to my shocking and completely unique reading of the wedding garment, I want to address one historical notion about the garments that comes up quite frequently. Many commentators have offered that the wedding garments would have been provided under ancient custom by the king himself or by the host of the wedding feast. And so then not wearing the wedding garment would be doubly inappropriate. This is at best controversial, and based on my study is not founded on much evidence. Men like Gibbs and Albright argue against such a custom. It seems like the original reading of this idea of the garment being provided by the king or the host was to make up this kind of allegorical representation of faith, then that the garment or faith is provided by God to the guests. It then being something provided by the king is then something that allows for other sorts of doctrinal implications that we won't get into. But either way, what are the garments? We have alluded to the interpretation that it's faith, but the possibilities are really innumerable. From faith to love to selflessness to even an eschatological view that the wedding garment is representative of a resurrected state, there's all sorts of possibilities. I personally have found most all of these a little bit unsatisfactory. As I've said from the beginning of this section on Matthew 22, I see this parable as more than just judgment and invitation. I see even more than just the powerful image of the wedding feast. What I see here in the last refrain of this great parable is a word of warning to those who would be a part of the kingdom. Throughout Matthew's gospel, he has made sure to include the warnings of Jesus against those that are saved, who think that they are saved, but actually are not. France points this out by citing Matthew 7, Matthew 18, even Matthew 25 and the parable of the unprepared bridesmaids, or even the parable of the weeds and the wheat growing together in Matthew 13. And Paul's epistle continues in a similar sort of vein with the constant contrast between the people that you should be and the people that you were. In fact, he writes to Christians and tells them, you can't be vain, vile, slanderous, immoral, drunkards, full of hate. Instead, you need to be loving, selfless people who bear one another's burdens and edify one another. To help establish this connection, I again want to return to some of the work done by Gibbs, who looks at the wedding garment from the negative. Instead of asking the question, what does you need to clothe yourself with, he asks, what does it mean to be unworthy? And in asking this, he identifies the punishment for this individual, being cast out into the weeping and gnashing of teeth. We're all familiar with that phrase, but how often have we taken the time to picture what this looks like? The idea of gnashing teeth is the same as the image of those men that ground their teeth at Stephen in Acts chapter 7 before killing him. This is hatred. This is violence. And this man who is unworthy is cast into outer darkness amongst those who vehemently despise God, gnash their teeth at him, and yet also weep for the darkness that they have been cast into. Combining this idea with our previous assertion of the garment representing the very godly characteristics of the Christian, I think we can hone in even more on the selfless love characterized by the Messiah himself. Not anger and hatred, but what we see in Jesus. We as Christians can't just accept the open invitation to dine with the King. We must also be the sort of people that gladly proclaim there is still more room. The garment is everything. It is faith, and it is love, and it is hope. It is resurrection through baptism. It is evangelism. It is a culminating image of all that as Christians we are supposed to clothe ourselves with. And while many scholars try to allegorically pinpoint each piece of this great parable, they sometimes miss this insightfully simplistic elegance of the image. Jesus, in this concluding refrain, summarizes what is one of the real challenges of any local church that has ever existed. The member that pulls against the character of the kingdom, that causes contention in what should be a place symbolized by its joyous celebration of a marriage long awaited. Jesus is preparing the world for what is coming. And as he faces down his last days, he has the wisdom to carve out a moment to prepare the world for the challenges we will face and the difficulties that will affect even the inside of the kingdom. I want to pause from my lecture for a moment, because this isn't in any sort of commentary or scholarly work that I've read, researched. This is just something that I see in the words of Jesus. I want us all to pause and consider for a moment this picture of what it means to be a guest at the wedding feast of the King's Son. I want us to consider the powerful implications of such a moment. We are invited to dine and to participate. And now as you imagine the true significance of a world that is finally reunited with the Creator through the Son, I want you to picture what your attire is. How are you clothed? Are you clothed in white linen that represents righteous works as described in Revelation 19? Are you clothed in a body that was raised from the watery grave to walk in newness of life? Are you clothed in unity of mind and spirit with the Son? Are you clothed with love and patience and kindness and gentleness? Yes, the garment is everything. Don't be like those that are cast out even though they think they are saved. Don't be the tares that grow with the wheat. Don't be the bridesmaids that forget to bring the oil and are locked out of the feast. I think it's important to pause and consider this, because no matter how technical we want to get with the Greek or how many scholars have penned books on these ideas, we ultimately need to come back to the realization of the truth that these are the words of the Messiah that have been preserved for our benefit. And they paint a picture that should be instructive to us about our own character and even the character of our congregations. And so then we see two parables, similar and yet different. Luke 14 taking place in the midst of Jesus' ministry and Matthew 22 at the end. And these different time points in Jesus' ministry allow for two different purposes. We could surely see the similarities, but what is striking are the subtle and powerful differences. Jesus tells the Pharisees to stop being so selfish and prideful and rather to seek to help all. And in Matthew 22, he speaks not to the Pharisees, but even to us, saying that if we accept this invitation, it is going to require all of who we are. And so finally, I want us all to see this. Yes, these two parables both have some sort of banquet. Both have people who reject the invitation. Yes, both even have an open invitation so that all can join in. What is more, though, is that Jesus has adapted these similarities with just subtle changes of details and language to tell different stories. Not just one about the master and the blessedness to dine with him, but also one to describe what worthiness looks like. Where so many try to look and find a single moment and say that Matthew and Luke adapted them to tell their stories, and where so many scholars give so much credit to the authors themselves and their cleverness, we need to see something else. We need to see the providence of God, and we need to see the master teacher. He isn't just witty or clever. He isn't just telling stories to try and make people feel good or feel bad. He isn't some moralist trying to impart some new way of living a happy life. His stories aren't banal attempts to repeat the wisdom of the day. He is the master teacher. He offers simple illustrations that have so many deep and layered truths that even now, after having taught and studied them all so many times, we each have come here to participate and listen to a lectureship to learn more and to understand them more. I have come. Even after teaching the parables earlier this year, I have come and listened and learned and participated. Only a master teacher can offer so much insight and so much meaning. And yet at the same time, these illustrations we looked at today could have been taught in 5 minutes and imparted its significant wisdom and insight on the listener. What has taken me the better part of an hour to explain was offered in a dozen or so verses. If I could leave you all with this one idea, it's this. Jesus is the master teacher, and he has offered us all a place at his table, for there is still room. Thank you.